The desert sun beat down on the 29 Palms shooting range with the kind of relentless intensity that made everything shimmer in waves of heat. Kira Olenev stood at the equipment table, her fingers tracing the edge of a range card while the other shooters gathered in their usual clusters, voices carrying across the sandy expanse with that particular brand of confidence that came from men who had spent years proving themselves with firearms. She had arrived early, as she always did, her movements economical and precise as she checked wind conditions and reviewed the day's schedule posted on the weather corkboard near the rangemaster's shed. Chief Petty Officer Donovan Krause watched her from beneath the brim of his cover, his eyes narrowed against the glare. He had been running this range for 6 years, training everyone from fresh recruits to seasoned operators, and he prided himself on reading people within the first 5 minutes of meeting them. The woman standing alone at the equipment table did not fit any category he recognized. She wore standard range attire, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, nothing about her appearance suggesting anything beyond perhaps a weekend enthusiast who had somehow secured access to a military facility through connections or paperwork he had not bothered to examine closely. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have witnessed similar acts of courage or unexpected skill where you are from. 3 men approached the firing line with the swagger of competitive shooters, their conversation punctuated by laughter that suggested they had already sized up everyone present and found the competition lacking. The tallest one, a contractor named Vince Halloran, carried a custom rifle case with stickers from various shooting competitions plastered across its surface like badges of honor. His companions, both former Marines who now worked private security, flanked him with the easy camaraderie of men who had shared foxholes and bar fights in equal measure. Halloran's gaze swept across the range and stopped on Kira. He nudged the man beside him, a broad-shouldered shooter named Trip Wendell, and said something that made both of them grin. Kira did not look up from her range card, though Chief Krause noticed the slight pause in her movements, the momentary stillness that suggested she had registered their attention even if she chose not to acknowledge it. The morning briefing was scheduled for 0000, and Chief Krause stepped to the center of the covered pavilion where the shooters had begun to assemble. 12 men and 1 woman, he noted, running through the roster in his mind. The special training session had been organized to evaluate long-range precision capabilities, with the highlight being live fire exercises using the Barrett M82A1, the legendary 50-caliber rifle that had achieved almost mythical status among shooters. Few had the opportunity to fire one, and fewer still could handle its punishing recoil and demanding accuracy requirements. Chief Krause began his briefing with the usual safety protocols, his voice carrying the authority of thousands of hours spent on ranges around the world. He outlined the day's schedule, building toward the Barrett demonstration that would take place after lunch when the wind typically calmed. The shooters listened with varying degrees of attention, most of them already familiar with range procedures, their minds clearly focused on the afternoon's main event. Kira stood at the back of the group, her posture relaxed but attentive. She made no effort to insert herself into the conversations happening around her, content to remain on the periphery while the men discussed their previous experiences with heavy rifles and debated the finer points of long-range ballistics. Halloran dominated the conversation as he usually did, his voice carrying over the others as he recounted a shot he had made at a competition in Wyoming, the distance growing slightly longer each time he told the story. When Chief Krause dismissed them to begin the morning's preliminary exercises, the shooters moved toward their assigned firing positions with practiced efficiency. The range stretched out before them, targets placed at intervals from 300 to 800 meters, the furthest ones barely visible as dark rectangles against the pale desert floor. Kira drew position 7, a station that placed her between Halloran and a quiet Army reservist named Corporal Hayes, who nodded at her politely before focusing on setting up his equipment. The morning progressed with the rhythmic crack of rifle fire, each shooter working through their qualification strings while Chief Krause and his 2 assistant instructors moved between positions, observing technique and recording scores. Kira shot steadily, her movements efficient and unhurried, the kind of economy of motion that suggested extensive training even if no one was paying close enough attention to notice. By mid-morning, the heat had intensified to the point where mirages danced across the range, distorting the distant targets into wavering shapes that challenged even experienced shooters. Chief Krause called a water break, and the shooters retreated to the shaded pavilion where coolers of ice water waited alongside protein bars and salt tablets. Kira filled her canteen and moved to a bench at the far end of the structure, her back against a support post, while the others clustered in their established groups. Halloran's voice carried clearly across the pavilion as he held court with his usual audience. He was discussing the Barrett, his hands gesturing expansively as he described the weapon specifications with the kind of detailed knowledge that came from extensive research, if not necessarily extensive experience. The 50 caliber round, he explained to the newer shooters, traveled at nearly 3,000 feet per second and could disable vehicles or eliminate targets at distances exceeding 2,000 meters in the right hands. Trip Wendell glanced toward Kira and said something to Halloran in a lower voice, though not low enough to prevent it from carrying. Halloran's response was louder, clearly intended to be heard. He wondered aloud how someone had managed to secure a slot in a specialized training session when they seemed more suited to administrative work than fieldcraft. The comment drew chuckles from several of the men, and Kira took a long drink from her canteen without shifting her gaze from the heat-shimmered desert beyond the pavilion. Chief Krause had noticed the dynamic developing throughout the morning. He had seen it before, the way certain shooters needed to establish dominance through verbal posturing, especially when they sensed any uncertainty about their position in the hierarchy. What he had also noticed, though he had not yet decided what to make of it, was the woman's complete lack of reaction. She did not bristle or respond, or show any sign that the comments affected her at all. That kind of composure was either the result of exceptional emotional control or the confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. The afternoon session began with shooters rotating through different weapon systems. Chief Krause had arranged for several precision rifles to be available, including an M110 semi-automatic sniper system, several Remington 700s in various configurations, and a Macmillan TAC-50 that drew appreciative looks from everyone present. Each shooter would have the opportunity to fire multiple weapons before the day's main event, the Barrett demonstration that had been scheduled for 1,500 hours when meteorological conditions were forecast to be optimal. Kira drew the M110 for her first rotation. The weapon was familiar to anyone with military training, a workhorse sniper rifle that had seen action in every theater of operations for the past 2 decades. She approached the firing line, checked the weapon with swift, practiced movements, and settled into position with an ease that would have been noteworthy to anyone watching closely. Chief Krause was watching closely. He observed the way she built her position from the ground up, the way her breathing settled into the rhythm that preceded accurate shooting, the way her finger indexed along the receiver until the moment of trigger press. Her first shot struck center mass at 600 meters. The second followed within 5 seconds, the impact point less than 2 inches from the first. She fired a 5-round group that could have been covered by a man's palm, then cleared the weapon and stood, her expression neutral as she marked her scores on the range card. Chief Krause made a note on his clipboard, a small notation that meant nothing to anyone but himself, a reminder to check the roster more carefully during the next break. Halloran took his turn at the same distance, his custom rifle a precision instrument that probably cost more than most people's cars. He was a competent shooter, Chief Krause acknowledged, his groups respectable, if not exceptional. He made sure everyone knew his scores, calling them out clearly, as if the targets themselves were not evidence enough. When he finished, he made a point of walking past Kira's station and examining her target with exaggerated scrutiny, offering a grudging comment about beginner's luck that suggested he had at least registered her performance, even if he was not ready to acknowledge its implications. The rotation continued through the afternoon, each shooter working through the available weapons while Chief Krause and his assistants maintained careful records and made quiet assessments. The temperature peaked at 108 degrees, the kind of heat that drained energy and tested concentration. Kira moved through each station with the same unhurried efficiency, her shooting consistent across different platforms and distances. She did not engage in the conversations that erupted between firing strings, did not participate in the friendly competitions or the less friendly verbal sparring that characterized the interactions among the more vocal shooters. At 14:30, Chief Krause called the group to order. The Barrett M82A1 had been set up on a reinforced bench at the furthest firing point, its massive profile unmistakable even at a distance. The weapon weighed nearly 30 pounds empty, its barrel extending more than 4 feet from the receiver, the entire system designed around the single purpose of delivering devastating accuracy at extreme distances. Chief Krause began his briefing on the weapon's characteristics, the unique challenges it presented, and the safety protocols that would govern its use. The Barrett M82A1 dominated the firing point like a piece of artillery that had been miniaturized just enough for one person to operate. Chief Krause stood beside it, his hand resting on the massive barrel as he continued his briefing. The weapon had been zeroed that morning by the range staff at 1,200 meters, he explained, but the targets for today's demonstration had been placed at varying distances up to 1,500 meters. Each shooter would have the opportunity to fire 3 rounds, and given the cost of .50 caliber ammunition and the physical demands of the weapon, 3 rounds were more than sufficient to evaluate capability. The shooters had gathered in a semicircle around the firing point, their attention fixed on the Barrett with expressions ranging from eager anticipation to barely concealed nervousness. Halloran stood at the front of the group, his posture suggesting he had already claimed first position even though Chief Krause had not yet announced the firing order. Trip Wendell stood beside him, along with the third member of their group, a former Marine Scout sniper named Deshaun Rourke who had maintained an uncharacteristic silence throughout the day. Chief Krause explained the recoil management system, the massive muzzle brake that redirected propellant gases to reduce the savage kick that would otherwise make the weapon nearly uncontrollable. Even with the brake, he cautioned, the recoil was substantial, the concussive blast significant enough to be felt by anyone standing within 20 feet of the shooter. He demonstrated the proper cheek weld, the importance of consistent shoulder placement, the way the bipod needed to be loaded to prevent the weapon from shifting during recoil. Kira stood at the back of the group, her attention on the Barrett, but her expression giving nothing away. She had maintained the same careful distance throughout the day, present but separate, observing without inserting herself into the social dynamics that swirled around her. Chief Krause noticed that Corporal Hayes, the quiet Army reservist, had positioned himself near her, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who preferred competence to conversation. The firing order was determined by the morning's qualification scores, which meant Halloran would indeed shoot first, followed by Rourke and then Trip Wendell. Chief Krause read through the list, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon stillness. Kira's name appeared 7th, roughly in the middle of the order, her morning score solid, but not exceptional enough to draw particular attention. She nodded slightly when her position was announced, then stepped back to give the first shooters room to prepare. Halloran approached the Barrett with visible confidence, his movements deliberate as he settled behind the weapon. Chief Krause positioned himself slightly behind and to the left, close enough to observe technique and intervene if necessary, but far enough to avoid the worst of the muzzle blast. The other shooters had moved to the observation area, a covered position offset from the firing line where they could watch without risk. The first shot was always dramatic. Even experienced shooters who had fired heavy weapons before found themselves impressed by the Barrett's authority. Halloran pressed his cheek to the stock, his eye finding the scope, his breathing settling into the familiar pattern. The trigger press came after a pause that suggested careful preparation, and then the weapon fired with a sound that seemed to compress the air itself, a thunderous crack followed by the distinctive ring of the muzzle brake doing its work. The impact was visible through spotting scopes at 1,200 meters, a dark puff against the tan target face. Halloran's shot had struck low and right, missing the center by perhaps 18 inches. Respectable for a first shot with an unfamiliar weapon at that distance, but not the dramatic demonstration of skill he had probably hoped to deliver. His second shot corrected the elevation, but remained right of center. The third shot, fired after a longer pause, found the target but still showed a consistent rightward bias that suggested either a zero issue or a fundamental problem with his wind call. Halloran stood and stepped back from the Barrett, his expression showing satisfaction despite the group's being far from exceptional. He announced his assessment that the weapon was pulling right, a comment that suggested the Barrett rather than his own technique was responsible for the dispersion. Chief Krause made notes on his clipboard without comment, his face professionally neutral. Rourke approached next, and his experience with precision rifles showed immediately. His first shot struck within 6 inches of center at 1,200 meters, a significant improvement over Halloran's group. His second and third shots clustered tightly, demonstrating both skill and the ability to manage the Barrett's demanding characteristics. He stood with a slight smile, the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had just outperformed someone who talked considerably more than he did. Trip Wendell followed with mixed results, his first shot excellent, but his second and third shots showing increasing dispersion as fatigue or recoil anticipation began to affect his technique. 2 more shooters followed, both competent but neither exceptional, their groups adequate but unremarkable. Chief Krause maintained his careful documentation, noting tendencies and technique issues that he would address in the debriefing. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, the light taking on the golden quality that made distance estimation more challenging. Chief Krause called Kira's name, and she stepped forward from the observation area with the same economical movements she had displayed all day. Halloran watched her approach with an expression that suggested he was preparing another comment about luck or beginner's fortune, his earlier displeasure at being outshot by Rourke apparently finding a more acceptable target. Kira moved to the firing point with steps that covered ground efficiently without appearing hurried. She set her range card on the bench beside the Barrett, her eyes moving across the weapon with the kind of systematic assessment that preceded any interaction with an unfamiliar firearm. Chief Krause watched her check the chamber, examine the scope settings, and test the bipod stability with small adjustments that suggested she understood the importance of a solid shooting platform. She settled behind the Barrett with a fluidity that made Chief Krause's attention sharpen. There was something in the way she built her position, the way her body aligned with the weapon, that spoke of extensive training. Her left hand found a forestock, her right hand wrapped around the pistol grip. Her cheek met the stock at precisely the angle that would allow proper scope alignment. The movements were not hesitant or experimental. They were practiced, automatic, the muscle memory of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. The other shooters watched with varying degrees of interest. Halloran stood with his arms crossed, his expression suggesting he expected to see confirmation of his assessment that her earlier performance had been nothing more than favorable circumstances. Rourke watched with more genuine curiosity, perhaps recognizing something in her setup that the others had missed. Corporal Hayes leaned forward slightly, his own experience allowing him to appreciate the quality of her position even before she fired. Chief Krause positioned himself in a standard observation spot. He had already noticed several things that did not align with his initial assessment of Kira as an inexperienced shooter with connections. The way she had adjusted the bipod loading, the way she had checked the scope parallax, the way her breathing had settled into the deep, controlled rhythm that preceded precision shooting. These were not the actions of someone hoping for beginner's luck. The wind had picked up slightly, a crosswind from the left that would push the massive 50 caliber projectile despite its weight and velocity. Kira's eyes moved to the wind flags positioned at intervals downrange, her head tilting slightly as she processed information that only experienced long-range shooters knew to gather. She made a small adjustment to her aim point, compensating for the wind with a correction that suggested she had already calculated the necessary hold. Her first shot broke with a timing that surprised Chief Krause. There had been no extended preparation, no visible hesitation or uncertainty. She had settled, assessed, aimed, and fired with the smooth efficiency of someone executing a familiar task. The Barrett's massive report rolled across the desert, the muzzle brake doing its work as the weapon recoiled straight back without the dramatic rise that less experienced shooters often experienced. Through the spotting scope, Chief Krause saw the impact at 1,200 meters. Center mass, perhaps 2 inches high and 1 inch right of absolute center. For a first shot with an unfamiliar weapon at that distance, it was exceptional. Not merely good or adequate or respectable. It was the kind of shot that suggested either remarkable natural talent or extensive professional training. Kira cycled the bolt with practiced efficiency, the massive cartridge ejecting as she chambered a fresh round. Her position had barely shifted, her body remaining in perfect alignment with the weapon. The second shot followed within 10 seconds of the first, and through the spotting scope, Chief Krause watched the impact strike less than 3 inches from the first hit. A 2-shot group that could be covered by a man's fist at 1,200 meters. The observation area had gone quiet. Even Halloran had stopped his commentary, his attention fixed on the target as the spotting scope operator called out the impact locations. Rourke had straightened from his casual lean against the support post, his expression showing the kind of respect that one professional gives another when witnessing genuine skill. Kira's third shot completed a group that measured roughly 4 inches across at 1,200 meters, accounting for the wind and the Barrett's inherent accuracy limitations. It was not just the best group of the day. It was the kind of shooting that most marksmen would struggle to achieve with weapons specifically designed for precision rather than the Barrett's primary role as an anti-material rifle. She stood and stepped back from the weapon, her expression unchanged, as if shooting a 4-inch group at 1,200 meters with a .50 caliber rifle was merely routine. She picked up her range card, made a brief notation, and moved back toward the observation area without ceremony or celebration. Chief Krause found himself holding his clipboard without having written anything, his mind cycling through the possible explanations for what he had just witnessed. Halloran recovered first, his voice cutting across the silence with a comment about target placement or wind conditions, some explanation that would account for the performance without acknowledging its exceptional nature. Trip Wendell nodded along, but his heart clearly was not in the dismissal. Rourke said nothing, his eyes following Kira as she returned to her position at the back of the observation area. The remaining shooters took their turns, but the atmosphere had shifted. Corporal Hayes shot well, his military training evident in his solid fundamentals. 2 civilian contractors managed respectable groups, their technique adequate, if not exceptional. A Marine Staff sergeant who had been quiet throughout the day put together a group that approached Rourke's performance, earning a nod of approval from Chief Krause. But the conversation during and after each shot kept returning to Kira's performance. The spotting scope operator, a senior enlisted man who had worked the range for 8 years, mentioned that he had rarely seen groups that tight with a Barrett under any circumstances. Another shooter wondered aloud about her background, where she might have trained, whether she had military experience that was not reflected in the roster information Chief Krause had received. Chief Krause himself was wondering the same things. The roster had listed her simply as Kira Olenev, civilian consultant, approved for the training session through channels that he had not questioned because they had appeared legitimate. But civilian consultants did not typically shoot like special operations personnel, and the performance he had just witnessed suggested training that went far beyond recreational shooting or even standard military marksmanship programs. The afternoon session concluded with Chief Krause announcing that the evening would include an advanced demonstration for those interested in testing their capabilities at extended ranges. The Barrett would remain available, he explained, and targets had been positioned at distances exceeding 1,500 meters for shooters who wanted to explore the weapon's maximum effective range. Participation was voluntary, he emphasized, given the increased difficulty and the physical demands of prolonged shooting with the .50 caliber system. Halloran immediately volunteered, his voice carrying across the group with renewed confidence. He had apparently processed his earlier performance and decided that the extended range would provide an opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that the standard distances had not fully revealed. Tripp, Wendell, and Rourke both indicated their interest, along with 4 other shooters whose morning and afternoon performances had marked them as serious competitors. Kira remained silent, her attention seemingly focused on noting wind conditions in her range card. Chief Kraus found himself watching for her response, curious whether she would accept the implicit challenge or maintain the low profile she had cultivated throughout the day. When he asked directly if she planned to participate in the evening session, she looked up from her notes and said simply that she would, her tone suggesting neither eagerness nor reluctance, but rather the neutral acceptance of a scheduled task. The break before the evening session provided an opportunity for shooters to rest, hydrate, and prepare equipment. Chief Kraus retreated to his office in the range control building, a small structure that contained files, communication equipment, and a computer terminal connected to the military personnel database. He pulled up the roster for the training session and found Kira's entry, noting that the information was remarkably sparse. Civilian consultant, approved through a special programs office he recognized as handling contracts for sensitive projects. No prior military service listed, no specific organizational affiliation beyond a consulting company name that meant nothing to him. He expanded his search, running her name through the broader personnel system with the kind of access that his position and security clearance provided. What he found was simultaneously illuminating and frustrating. Her name appeared in multiple databases, but the details were heavily redacted, entire sections of her file marked with classifications that indicated special operations involvement. He could see dates of service that suggested nearly a decade of active duty stations that included locations associated with specialized training programs, and commendations that were listed by number rather than description. Chief Kraus leaned back in his chair and considered the implications. The woman who had been shooting on his range all day was not a civilian consultant in any conventional sense. She was former military, almost certainly special operations, with a background that someone had taken considerable effort to obscure. The question was why she was here, participating in what was essentially a training evaluation exercise, and why she had allowed herself to be dismissed and underestimated throughout the day without correcting anyone's assumptions. The evening session began as the sun touched the western horizon, the light taking on the rich amber quality that photographers loved and shooters tolerated with careful adjustments to their scopes. Chief Kraus had positioned targets at 1,500, 1,700, and 1,900 meters, distances that pushed the Barrett to its practical limits and required shooters to account for factors that became increasingly significant at extended ranges. Bullet drop, wind drift, Coriolis effect, temperature, and air density all played roles in where a projectile would impact after traveling nearly a mile through the atmosphere. Halloran took the first attempt at 1,500 meters, his setup more deliberate than his earlier efforts. He fired 3 rounds, managing to impact the target with 2 of them, but with a dispersion pattern that measured over 2 feet across. Respectable shooting at that distance, but far from exceptional. He stepped back from the Barrett with a satisfied expression, apparently considering 2 hits at 1,500 meters to be worthy of recognition. Rourke followed with better results, his 3 shots clustering within 18 inches at the same distance. His military training and natural talent combined to produce shooting that would have been considered excellent in most contexts, and several of the other shooters offered verbal recognition of his performance. Tripp, Wendell managed 1 solid hit at 1,500 meters, with his other 2 shots missing the target entirely, victims of wind calls that proved incorrect or recoil management that broke down under fatigue. 2 more shooters attempted the 1,500-meter target with mixed results before Chief Kraus called Kira forward. The light had continued to fade, and the targets were becoming increasingly difficult to see clearly even through high-quality optics. The wind had shifted, now coming from the right rear quarter at an angle that required complex compensation. Chief Kraus mentioned these factors to the group, noting that the shooting conditions had degraded since the earlier session. Kira approached the Barrett and settled into position with the same efficiency she had displayed before. She spent more time on this setup, her eyes moving between the distant target and the wind flags, her head tilting as she processed sensory information that extended beyond what optics could reveal. The other shooters watched in silence now, the earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine curiosity about whether her previous performance would translate to the significantly more challenging extended range. Her first shot at 1,500 meters struck within 6 inches of center, the impact clearly visible through spotting scopes despite the fading light. The second shot followed after a brief pause, striking so close to the first that the impacts were nearly indistinguishable. The third shot completed a group that measured less than 8 inches across, a level of precision that approached the mechanical limits of the Barrett system at that distance. The observation area remained silent for a moment after the third impact was confirmed. Then Rourke spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the evening stillness. He asked the question that Chief Krause suspected several others were thinking. Where exactly had she trained, and what organization had provided instruction that produced shooting of that caliber? Kira stood from the Barrett and turned to face the group, her expression unchanged despite the direct question. She offered a brief response that she had received training through various programs over the years, a non-answer that provided no real information while technically addressing the inquiry. Rourke nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized the careful evasion for what it was. Chief Krause watched the exchange with interest, noting how she deflected without appearing defensive or secretive, simply maintaining the same professional distance she had exhibited throughout the day. Halloran stepped forward, his earlier confidence returning now that the focus had shifted away from pure performance comparison. He suggested that anyone could have a good day, that consistency across multiple sessions and varying conditions was what truly separated competent shooters from exceptional ones. His tone suggested challenge rather than genuine observation, and Chief Krause recognized the familiar pattern of someone attempting to reclaim status through verbal positioning when physical performance had not provided the desired results. Chief Krause intervened before the conversation could develop into something less productive. He announced that the 1,700-meter target was available for anyone who wanted to attempt it, noting that the light was fading rapidly and that conditions would only become more challenging. The extended distance represented a significant increase in difficulty, he explained, with bullet flight time exceeding 2 seconds and wind effects multiplied across the additional distance. 3 shooters declined, recognizing their limitations or simply exhausted from the day's activities. Halloran volunteered immediately, joined by Rourke and 2 others who had performed well during earlier sessions. Kira remained where she was, neither volunteering nor declining, her posture suggesting she would participate if called, but would not actively seek the opportunity. Chief Krause added her name to the list, his voice neutral, though his reasons for doing so extended beyond simple roster management. The 1,700-meter target was barely visible in the gathering dusk, a pale rectangle that wavered in and out of clarity depending on atmospheric conditions and the angle of observation. Chief Krause had position light panels behind the targets to provide some contrast, but even with that assistance, the shooting required as much intuition and experience as technical skill. The wind had become more variable, shifting in velocity and direction in ways that made consistent compensation nearly impossible. Halloran's attempt at 1,700 meters resulted in 1 questionable hit and 2 clear misses. He argued about the target lighting and wind conditions, suggesting that the exercise had moved beyond reasonable evaluation and into circumstances where success was more about chance than skill. Chief Krause acknowledged the difficult conditions, but noted that combat environments rarely provided ideal circumstances, a comment that drew nods from the military experienced shooters even if it did not mollify Halloran's frustration. The next 2 shooters managed no hits at all, their rounds disappearing into the desert darkness beyond the targets. Rourke approached the Barrett with visible determination, his setup taking longer than previous attempts as he worked to extract every piece of available information from the degraded conditions. His first shot missed, the impact visible in the dirt behind the target. His second shot appeared to hit, though the light panels made confirmation difficult. His third shot missed as well, and he stepped back from the weapon with a shake of his head, acknowledging the limits of his capability under the circumstances. Kira took position as full darkness settled across the range. Chief Kraus had activated additional lighting, but it provided only marginal improvement in visibility. The wind had calmed slightly, though it remained unpredictable at the micro level, eddies and currents invisible to observation but critical to bullet trajectory. She settled behind the Barrett and began her preparation, her movements deliberate as she gathered information that would inform her shooting. The pause before her first shot extended longer than her previous attempts, perhaps 30 seconds of absolute stillness as she processed variables and calculated corrections. When the shot broke, the muzzle flash was dramatic in the darkness, a brilliant flare that momentarily destroyed night vision. Through the spotting scope, Chief Kraus saw the impact strike the target near center mass, a hit that was unmistakable despite the poor visibility. Her second shot followed after another extended pause, and again the impact was clearly visible on target. The third shot completed what appeared to be a group measuring less than 15 inches at 1,700 meters, shooting that would have been remarkable under ideal conditions and was nearly inexplicable given the circumstances. Chief Kraus lowered his spotting scope and found himself looking at Kira with undisguised curiosity, his professional reserve insufficient to mask his reaction to what he had just witnessed. The remaining shooters stood in silence, their earlier conversations about technique and conditions forgotten in the face of performance that transcended normal expectations. Even Halloran had no immediate comment, his expression suggesting he was still processing what he had seen. Corporal Hayes spoke quietly to the shooter beside him, his words not carrying to Chief Kraus, but his tone suggesting admiration rather than skepticism. Chief Kraus made a decision that he knew would either clarify the situation or create complications he might regret. He announced that one final target remained at 1,900 meters, nearly 2,000 meters, a distance that represented the absolute limit of what the Barrett could reasonably achieve with standard ammunition under any conditions. He looked directly at Kira and asked if she would be willing to attempt it, his phrasing making clear that this was a request rather than a requirement. She met his gaze for a moment, and Chief Kraus saw something in her eyes that confirmed what he had begun to suspect. This was not a civilian consultant playing at being a shooter. This was a professional, someone with training and experience that matched or exceeded his own, someone who had chosen to remain anonymous and unassuming until circumstances forced revelation. She nodded once and said she would attempt the shot, her voice carrying no trace of hesitation or false modesty. The atmosphere on the range had changed fundamentally. What had begun as a routine training evaluation had transformed into something else entirely, a demonstration that none of them had anticipated and that would be discussed long after the day concluded. Chief Kraus prepared the firing point, checking the Barrett's systems and ensuring that everything was optimal for what would likely be the most challenging shot anyone had attempted on his range. The 1,900-meter target existed at the very edge of visibility, even with the light panels activated. Chief Kraus had positioned it that morning as an aspirational goal, never truly expecting that anyone would attempt it under the degraded conditions that now prevailed. The distance represented more than a physical challenge. At that range, the .50 caliber projectile would be in flight for nearly 3 seconds, descending in a dramatic arc that required the shooter to aim dozens of feet above the target. Wind effects would be magnified across the extended distance. Temperature and air density would play significant roles, and even the rotation of the Earth itself would influence the bullet's path through the Coriolis effect. Kira approached the Barrett with the same measured steps she had used throughout the day, but Chief Kraus noticed subtle differences in her preparation this time. She spent longer examining the weapon, her hands moving across the stock and receiver with the familiarity of someone who had logged countless hours with the system. She adjusted the scope's parallax with minute precision, moving between the adjustment and the distant target with a rhythm that suggested she was using references invisible to everyone else. The wind flags had become difficult to read in the darkness, but Kira stood behind the firing point for several minutes before settling into position, her head tilted as she gathered information through senses that extended beyond sight. Chief Krause had seen this before in the most experienced snipers he had worked with, the ability to feel wind patterns through pressure changes and temperature variations, to integrate multiple sensory inputs into calculations that produced results conventional analysis could not achieve. When she finally settled behind the Barrett, her position was different from her previous attempts. Her body alignment had shifted slightly, her shoulders canted at an angle that suggested she was compensating for factors that only she had identified. Her breathing deepened, the rhythm slowing as she entered the focused state that preceded extreme precision shooting. The other shooters had moved closer to the observation position, their earlier conversations abandoned in favor of watching what was unfolding at the firing point. Chief Krause positioned himself where he could observe both Kira and the distant target through his spotting scope. He had worked with hundreds of shooters over his career, had witnessed exceptional marksmanship under challenging conditions, but something about this moment felt different. The combination of distance, darkness, and difficulty had created circumstances where success would require not just skill, but mastery. The kind of capability that separated competent professionals from true experts. The pause before the shot extended past a minute, then past 2 minutes. Kira remained absolutely motionless behind the Barrett, her eye to the scope, her finger resting on the trigger with pressure that held just short of the breakpoint. Chief Krause recognized what she was doing, waiting for a moment when multiple variables aligned, when wind and light and atmospheric conditions created a brief window of opportunity that would not repeat. When the shot finally broke, the sound seemed to carry differently in the night air, the muzzle flash painting everything in stark contrast for a fraction of a second. Chief Krause's, I was already at the spotting scope, his attention fixed on the distant target. The seconds stretched as the bullet traveled its long arc through the darkness. Then the impact flare appeared on the target, clearly visible despite the distance, striking in a location that Chief Krause's experience told him was remarkably close to center. The observation area erupted in reactions that ranged from quiet exclamations to outright disbelief. Rourke stepped forward to verify what he had seen, his own spotting scope confirming the impact location. Halloran stood with his arms hanging at his sides, his expression unreadable in the darkness, but his body language suggesting he had abandoned any attempt to explain away what he was witnessing. Kira cycled the Barrett's bolt, her movements efficient as she chambered the second round. Chief Krause wondered if she would attempt another shot or declare success with a single hit. A hit at 1,900 meters under these conditions was already beyond what most shooters could achieve. Attempting to duplicate it risked failure that would diminish the achievement, a practical consideration that many professionals would weigh carefully. She settled back into position without hesitation, her preparation for the second shot taking less time than the first. Whatever information she had gathered during the initial attempt was apparently still valid, still sufficient to guide her calculations. The second shot broke after perhaps 45 seconds, and again Chief Krause watched through the spotting scope as the impact flare appeared on the distant target. The second hit struck within what appeared to be 2 feet of the first, an incredible achievement that suggested the initial impact had not been fortunate circumstance, but rather the product of precise calculation and flawless execution. Chief Krause heard himself exhale, a sound he had not realized he was holding back. Around him, the other shooters reacted with a mixture of professional admiration and personal astonishment. Kira prepared for the third shot with the same methodical approach, and Chief Krause found himself hoping she would complete what would be a group for the ages. 3 hits at 1,900 meters in darkness would be a story told for years on ranges around the world. The kind of shooting that became legendary not because anyone doubted its truth, but because so few could comprehend how it was possible. The third shot took longer to prepare than the second, suggesting the conditions had shifted and required recalculation. When it broke, Chief Krause tracked its impact through his scope with intensity that bordered on willing the bullet to its target. The impact flare appeared, perhaps 3 feet from the first 2 hits, completing a group that measured roughly 4 feet across at 1,900 meters in near total darkness. The silence that followed the third impact was profound, broken finally by Corporal Hayes, who said quietly that he had never seen anything like that in 8 years of military service. Rourke nodded in agreement, his expression showing the kind of respect that one professional gives another when witnessing performance that transcends normal categories of skill. Even Trip Wendell, who had participated in Halloran's earlier dismissiveness, looked genuinely impressed, his attention fixed on Kira as she stood and stepped back from the Barrett. Chief Krause approached her as she cleared the weapon, his mind cycling through questions that professional courtesy suggested he should not ask directly. She met his gaze with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the day, and he recognized in that moment that she would not volunteer information about her background or training unless circumstances required it. But he also knew that he could not let the day end without at least attempting to understand who she was and how she had acquired capabilities that exceeded nearly everyone he had worked with during his career. Chief Krause called an end to the evening session, announcing that the range would close for the night and that a full debriefing would be conducted the following morning. The shooters began collecting their equipment, their conversations animated as they discussed what they had witnessed. Kira moved to gather her range cards and personal gear, her movements unhurried despite the attention that kept drifting in her direction. Several shooters approached her with questions about technique and training, and she responded with the same polite deflections she had employed earlier, providing general observations about fundamentals without revealing specifics about her background. Rourke waited until the others had dispersed before approaching her directly. He extended his hand and introduced himself properly, noting his background as a Marine Scout sniper and his current work in executive protection. His tone carried genuine respect rather than the competitive edge that had characterized many of the day's interactions. He asked if she would be willing to share any insights about long-range shooting in challenging conditions, framing it as a professional inquiry rather than an attempt to extract classified information. Kira shook his hand and offered a response that acknowledged his skill while maintaining her careful boundaries. She mentioned that patience was often more valuable than equipment, that reading environmental conditions required practice and attention to subtle indicators that most people overlooked. Rourke nodded, recognizing that she was providing real insight, even if she was not revealing the specific training pipeline that had developed her capabilities. He thanked her and mentioned that if she ever needed work in the private security sector, people with her abilities could write their own contracts. Halloran had collected his equipment and departed without speaking to Kira directly, though Chief Krause had noticed him watching the interaction between her and Rourke with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his earlier judgments. Trip Wendell offered a brief nod of acknowledgement as he left, a gesture that fell short of apology, but at least indicated recognition that his initial dismissiveness had been misplaced. Chief Krause waited until most of the shooters had cleared the range before approaching Kira. He carried a clipboard with the day's documentation, though his interest in speaking with her extended well beyond administrative requirements. He complimented her shooting directly, noting that in 6 years of running the range, he had never witnessed performance of that caliber under those conditions. She thanked him with the same professional courtesy she had shown everyone, neither deflecting the praise nor expanding upon it. He asked if she had a few minutes to discuss the day's activities in his office, framing it as a routine debriefing, though both of them understood the conversation would likely extend beyond routine matters. She agreed without hesitation, following him to the range control building where the air conditioning provided welcome relief from the desert heat that persisted even after sunset. Chief Krause gestured to a chair opposite his desk and closed the door, providing privacy that suggested the conversation would be more candid than those conducted in public. He began by explaining that he had reviewed her file during the afternoon break, noting the redactions and classifications that indicated special operations background. He made clear that he was not asking her to reveal anything that operational security prohibited, but that he had worked with enough specialized units to recognize capabilities when he saw them. Her shooting that day had been exceptional by any standard, but the performance at 1,900 meters in darkness had been something else entirely, the kind of skill that suggested training with units that most people had never heard of and that the military did not officially acknowledge existed. Kira listened without interrupting, her expression giving nothing away. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment before responding with careful precision. She confirmed that she had military experience, that she had received specialized training in precision marksmanship, among other disciplines, and that her current status as a civilian consultant was accurate, even if it did not fully represent her capabilities or background. She noted that her presence at the training session had been arranged through proper channels and that she had participated in good faith, though she acknowledged that perhaps she should have been more forthcoming about her skill level. Chief Kraus waved off the suggestion that she had done anything inappropriate. He explained that his concern was not about protocol, but about understanding. In his experience, shooters with her level of capability typically came from very specific backgrounds, and those backgrounds usually meant they had seen combat in environments where precision shooting was not a sport or training exercise, but a matter of survival and mission success. He wanted to know if she was willing to share what had brought her to his range and why she had allowed herself to be underestimated throughout the day. She considered the question before answering, and Chief Kraus recognized the careful calculation of someone deciding how much truth to reveal. She explained that she had left active service 18 months earlier after nearly a decade in units that required her to maintain a low profile and avoid drawing attention. The habit of remaining unremarkable had become ingrained, a survival mechanism that extended beyond operational necessity into everyday life. When civilians, or even military personnel who lacked appropriate clearances, made assumptions about her capabilities based on appearance or demeanor, she had learned that correction often created more complications than it solved. The training session had been arranged by a former commander who now worked in the defense contracting sector. She continued. He had thought it might be useful for her to maintain currency with weapons systems and long-range shooting, while also evaluating whether she might be interested in consulting work that required her particular skill set. She had not anticipated that the session would include shooters like Halloran, who seemed to require validation through diminishing others. But she had encountered similar personalities throughout her career and had developed patience for managing such interactions. Chief Kraus listened with growing understanding. He had worked with enough special operations personnel to recognize the pattern she described, the way that highly trained individuals often preferred anonymity to recognition, the way that public acknowledgement of capabilities could create security concerns or unwanted attention. He asked if she would be willing to share which unit she had served with, then immediately added that she should feel free to decline if the answer fell within classified parameters. She smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of amusement he had seen from her all day. She noted that even asking the question suggested he already knew the answer would be classified, which meant he understood the world she had inhabited. She could tell him that she had been a sniper, that she had deployed to multiple theaters, and that her longest confirmed kill exceeded 2,800 meters. Beyond that, she said, the details were both classified and increasingly irrelevant to her current life. Chief Kraus absorbed the information about the 2,800-meter kill with the kind of stillness that came from hearing something that fundamentally recontextualized everything that had preceded it. 2,800 meters was nearly 1,700 miles, a distance at which the target would be barely visible even through high-powered optics, where bullet drop would measure in dozens of feet, and where wind effects could push the projectile off course by meters. A confirmed kill at that distance placed her among perhaps a dozen shooters in the entire world, possibly fewer, and certainly marked her as someone who had operated at the absolute pinnacle of the precision shooting discipline. He asked how she had managed the transition from that level of operational intensity to civilian life, a question that he knew from experience had no simple answer. Many special operations personnel struggled with the shift, finding that civilian environments lacked the clarity and purpose that had defined their military service. She acknowledged the difficulty, noting that the first year had been particularly challenging as she worked to establish a sense of identity beyond the roles and missions that had consumed her adult life. The consulting work helped, she explained, because it allowed her to maintain connections to the community and skill set that had defined her career while also creating space for other aspects of life that military service had required her to postpone or abandon. She had begun teaching at a private training facility that catered to law enforcement and executive protection professionals, sharing knowledge about long-range shooting and tactical operations in ways that did not compromise classified information but still provided value to people who needed those skills. Chief Krause mentioned that he occasionally contracted with similar facilities, providing instruction on heavy weapons systems and advanced marksmanship. He wondered if their paths might have crossed at industry conferences or training symposiums, though he suspected that someone with her background probably maintained a lower profile than most instructors. She confirmed that she generally avoided large gatherings, preferring unknown instruction or small group sessions where she could control information flow and maintain the anonymity she valued. The conversation shifted to the practical matter of the following day's schedule. Chief Krause explained that the training session would conclude with a final qualification exercise and a comprehensive debriefing where he would discuss each shooter's performance and provide recommendations for continued development. He asked if she would be comfortable with him acknowledging her exceptional shooting during the public debriefing, or if she preferred that he minimize attention to her performance. Kira considered the question with visible care, weighing factors that Chief Krause could only partially understand. She finally said that honest assessment was acceptable, that attempting to conceal or minimize her performance would probably create more questions than it answered, given how many people had witnessed the evening session. However, she requested that he avoid specifics about her background beyond confirming that she had military experience and specialized training. The other shooters did not need to know unit designations or operational history, only enough to understand that her shooting had been the product of professional development rather than natural talent or fortunate circumstances. Chief Krause agreed to her terms, appreciating both her pragmatism and her understanding that complete anonymity was no longer possible after the day's demonstrations. He mentioned that several of the shooters, particularly Rourke and Corporal Hayes, would likely approach her with professional interest, possibly offering opportunities for collaborative work or requesting mentorship. She indicated that she was open to such conversations, noting that building relationships within the professional shooting community was part of why her former commander had suggested she participate in sessions like this one. They discussed technical aspects of the Barrett shooting, with Chief Krause asking about her approach to calculating corrections at extreme distances. She provided insights that reflected deep understanding of ballistics, atmospheric science, and the intuitive elements that separated competent long-range shooting from true mastery. She described the process of reading wind patterns through multiple indicators, the way that temperature gradients at different altitudes affected bullet trajectory, the importance of understanding how bullets behaved in transonic flight when velocity dropped below the speed of sound. Chief Krause found himself making notes, recognizing that he was receiving instruction from someone whose experience exceeded his own despite his years of professional development. She spoke about patience as a technical skill rather than merely a temperamental quality, explaining how waiting for optimal conditions could transform an impossible shot into a merely difficult one. She discussed the psychological aspects of extreme distance shooting, the way that doubt and second-guessing could corrupt calculations that were technically sound, the necessity of trusting preparation and execution even when sensory feedback suggested uncertainty. The conversation extended past an hour, ranging across topics that included equipment selection, training methodologies, and the evolving role of precision marksmanship in modern military operations. Chief Krause mentioned developments in ammunition technology and optics systems that were beginning to push the boundaries of what was possible at extended ranges. Kira listened with interest, asking informed questions that revealed she maintained awareness of technical developments even after leaving active service. Eventually, Chief Krause glanced at his watch and noted the late hour, acknowledging that they both had an early start the following morning. He thanked her for her candor and for the insights she had shared, noting that conversations like this one were rare and valuable in his profession. She responded with genuine warmth, suggesting that she had appreciated the opportunity to speak with someone who understood the context of her background without requiring detailed explanations. As she stood to leave, Chief Krause mentioned one final observation. He said that while her shooting had been exceptional, what had impressed him equally was her composure throughout the day, her ability to maintain professionalism and patience despite provocations that would have prompted many people to respond with demonstration or confrontation. She paused at the door and said simply that operational experience had taught her that the most effective responses often came from showing rather than telling, and that people who needed to prove themselves through words rarely possessed the substance to back them up. Chief Krause smiled at that, recognizing the truth in her assessment. He wished her a good evening and watched as she departed into the darkness beyond the range control building. He remained at his desk for several minutes after she left, reviewing his notes from the day and considering how he would frame the debriefing to acknowledge her exceptional performance while respecting her desire for limited disclosure about her background. The task would require careful balance, but he had spent enough time managing sensitive information to understand how to provide honest assessment without compromising operational security or personal privacy. The following morning would bring closure to the training session, but Chief Krause suspected that the conversations and connections initiated by Kira's demonstration would extend well beyond the formal conclusion of the program. Word would spread through the shooting community about what had occurred on his range, and while details might be embellished or distorted in retelling, the essential truth would remain that someone had demonstrated capabilities that most shooters could only aspire to achieve. The morning sun rose over the 29 Palms range with the same relentless intensity as the previous day, though the atmosphere among the assembled shooters had changed dramatically. Conversations that had been dominated by competitive posturing and casual dismissiveness now carried a different tone, marked by speculation about Kira's background and technical discussions about the shooting they had witnessed. She arrived at the range with the same quiet efficiency as before, acknowledging greetings from several shooters who had previously ignored her presence. Chief Krause had structured the final morning around a qualification exercise that would allow each shooter to demonstrate their capabilities across multiple distances and weapon systems. The Barrett would remain available, he announced, but the primary focus would be on establishing baseline proficiency standards that participants could reference for future training and development. Scores would be recorded officially, and each shooter would receive a detailed assessment that identified strengths and areas requiring continued work. The qualification began with standard precision rifles at ranges from 300 to 800 meters, conditions that most of the shooters could handle with reasonable competence. Halloran shot well, his fundamentals solid, even if his performance lacked the exceptional quality he clearly believed he possessed. Rourke demonstrated the consistent excellence that had marked his previous shooting, his groups tight, and his shot placement methodical. Trip Wendell and Corporal Hayes both performed at levels appropriate to their training and experience, neither exceptional nor deficient. Kira's qualification shooting maintained the same standard she had established the previous day, her groups measuring among the smallest on the range, and her shot placement demonstrating precision that exceeded what the weapon systems were designed to achieve. Chief Krause noted that she was no longer attempting to blend into the background, no longer moderating her performance to avoid attention. She shot with the same professional efficiency as before, but without the careful self-limitation that had characterized her morning session the previous day. When the qualification exercise concluded, Chief Krause assembled the group in the covered pavilion for the formal debriefing. He had prepared written assessments for each shooter, documents that would become part of their training records and that many would use to support applications for advanced courses or professional certifications. He began by thanking everyone for their participation and professionalism, noting that the session had provided valuable data about current capabilities and future training requirements. He worked through the roster systematically, providing each shooter with direct feedback about their performance. His assessments were honest but constructive, identifying specific technical issues while also acknowledging areas of strength. Halloran received recognition for his consistent performance across multiple weapon systems, though Chief Krause also noted tendencies toward overconfidence that sometimes led to rushed shot execution. Rourke's assessment praised his fundamentals and suggested that additional training on environmental reading could elevate his already impressive capabilities. When Chief Krause reached Kira's assessment, the pavilion fell silent in a way that suggested everyone had been waiting for this moment. He began by noting that her qualification scores placed her in the top performance bracket, a statement that was factually accurate but dramatically understated the reality of what she had demonstrated. He paused, then continued with carefully chosen words that acknowledged her exceptional ability while respecting her request for limited disclosure. He stated that she had brought professional-level capabilities to the training session, capabilities that reflected extensive, specialized training and operational experience. Her shooting at extended ranges, particularly during the previous evening's demonstration, had exceeded the performance standards typically associated with conventional military training. He mentioned that she had confirmed military service in specialized roles that required precision marksmanship at extreme distances, and that her longest confirmed engagement had been at ranges that represented the absolute limits of what current weapons technology could achieve. The shooters listened with complete attention, several of them nodding as Chief Krause's assessment confirmed suspicions that had developed throughout the previous day. Halloran's expression remained carefully neutral, though Chief Krause noticed the tension in his jaw that suggested he was processing information that contradicted his initial assessment of Kira's capabilities. Rourke smiled slightly, as if Chief Krause's words validated conclusions he had already reached. Chief Krause continued by noting that Kira's presence had provided everyone with an opportunity to observe world-class marksmanship under challenging conditions, something that few shooters ever witnessed firsthand. He suggested that her demonstration of patience, precision, and professional composure represented standards that everyone present should aspire to achieve, regardless of their current skill level or intended application of shooting skills. He concluded her assessment by stating that she had agreed to be available for questions about technique and training methodology, though he cautioned that operational security considerations would limit the specifics she could discuss about her military background. Anyone interested in learning from her experience was encouraged to approach her professionally and respectfully, recognizing that they were speaking with someone whose expertise had been proven under circumstances far more demanding than anything they had encountered on the range. When Chief Krause finished the formal assessments, he opened the floor for questions and discussion. Corporal Hayes was first to speak, asking Kira directly about her approach to reading wind patterns at extended ranges. She provided a thoughtful response that balanced technical detail with accessibility, explaining how she used multiple indicators to build a complete picture of atmospheric conditions rather than relying on single data points. Rourke asked about training progression, how someone developed the patience and discipline required for extreme distance shooting. Kira described the process as iterative, explaining that capability built gradually through countless repetitions and careful analysis of what worked and what failed. She emphasized that natural talent mattered far less than structure practice and willingness to learn from mistakes, a perspective that several shooters found encouraging. Even Halloran asked a question, though his tone suggested the inquiry was driven more by professional obligation than genuine curiosity. He wanted to know if she thought the Barrett was the optimal platform for extreme distance precision work, or if other weapons systems offered advantages. Kira responded diplomatically, noting that the Barrett excelled in its designed role, but that mission requirements should dictate weapon selection rather than personal preference or platform reputation. Chief Krause recognized the response as both technically accurate and politically astute, answering the question without diminishing anyone's equipment choices. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, ranging across topics that included ammunition selection, scope technology, physical conditioning for precision shooting, and the psychological aspects of performing under pressure. Kira answered each question with the same measured professionalism she had displayed throughout the session, sharing knowledge without condescension and acknowledging limitations in her own experience when questions ventured into areas outside her expertise. Chief Krause watched the dynamic with satisfaction, recognizing that what had begun as a standard training evaluation had evolved into something more valuable, a genuine exchange of knowledge among professionals who had moved beyond competitive posturing into collaborative learning. As the formal debriefing concluded, Chief Krause distributed certificates of completion along with the detailed written assessments he had prepared. The shooters began collecting their equipment and preparing for departure. Though the process took considerably longer than typical training sessions as conversations continued to develop around the technical topics Kira had addressed. Several shooters exchanged contact information, discussing possibilities for future training collaborations or simply maintaining professional networks that the session had established. Rourke approached Kira with a business card and a direct proposition. His executive protection firm frequently needed specialists who could provide advanced training to security personnel, particularly for clients who required protection in environments where long-range threats were realistic concerns. He mentioned that the compensation was substantial and that the work schedule could be structured around her other commitments. She accepted his card and promised to consider the opportunity, noting that her current consulting arrangements left room for additional projects if the fit was appropriate. Corporal Hayes waited until Rourke had finished before introducing himself more formally. He explained that he worked as a platoon leader in an Army Reserve unit that included a designated marksman program, and that his soldiers would benefit enormously from instruction by someone with her operational experience. He acknowledged that military budgets were limited and that he probably could not afford her commercial rates, but wondered if she might be interested in occasionally volunteering her time to work with soldiers who needed advanced training. Kira responded with genuine interest, noting that she maintained connections to military training programs and would be willing to explore ways to contribute. Trip Wendell offered a straightforward apology for his behavior during the previous day's session. He said that he had allowed competitive instincts and association with Halloran to cloud his judgment, and that her shooting had reminded him why humility mattered more than ego in professional contexts. She accepted his apology graciously, suggesting that the shooting community benefited when people learned from experiences rather than becoming defensive about mistakes. Halloran himself approached last, after most of the other shooters had departed or moved out of immediate earshot. His body language suggested discomfort, the posture of someone undertaking a task they found unpleasant but necessary. He acknowledged that he had misjudged her capabilities and had been dismissive in ways that were unprofessional. He stopped short of a full apology, but the admission itself represented significant movement from someone whose confidence typically prevented such concessions. Kira responded with the same measured professionalism she had maintained throughout the session. She noted that first impressions could be misleading and that the shooting range had a way of revealing truth regardless of initial assumptions. She suggested that his own shooting demonstrated solid fundamentals and that continued training would serve him well, a comment that managed to acknowledge his legitimate skills while also making clear that gaps remained in his capabilities. Halloran nodded, accepting the assessment without argument, then gathered his equipment and departed with noticeably less swagger than he had displayed upon arrival. Chief Krause had observed these interactions from a respectful distance, pleased to see that the social dynamics had resolved in ways that reflected genuine learning rather than merely forced courtesy. He approached Kira as the last of the other shooters cleared the range, carrying a folder that contained additional documentation he had not distributed during the public debriefing. He explained that he would be filing an official report about the training session that would include observations about each participant's performance. Her shooting, he noted, would be described in terms that accurately reflected its exceptional nature while maintaining appropriate classification boundaries. He wanted her to know that his report would likely generate interest from various military and government organizations that were always searching for individuals with advanced capabilities, and that she should be prepared for potential inquiries. Kira thanked him for the warning, noting that she had anticipated such consequences when she agreed to participate in the session. She mentioned that her former commander, the one who had arranged her attendance, had probably intended exactly that outcome, creating opportunities for her to demonstrate current capabilities to people who might offer meaningful work. She had mixed feelings about returning to environments closely connected to her military service, but she also recognized that her skills were specialized enough that conventional civilian employment would never fully utilize her training. Chief Krause shared his own experience transitioning between active duty and training roles, describing how he had found satisfaction in developing others' capabilities even when that work lacked the intensity of operational deployments. He suggested that teaching and consulting might provide similar balance for her, allowing her to remain connected to the professional community while also maintaining the separation she seemed to value. She listened thoughtfully, acknowledging that his perspective aligned with conclusions she had been reaching during her months of civilian adjustment. Their conversation shifted to technical matters, discussing developments in long-range shooting technology and methodology that Chief Krause thought might interest her. He mentioned experimental ammunition designs that promised improved accuracy at extreme distances, scope systems that incorporated atmospheric sensors and ballistic computers, and training methodologies that used virtual reality to supplement live-fire practice. Kira responded with informed questions that revealed she maintained awareness of these developments, though her access to cutting-edge technology had obviously diminished since leaving active service. Chief Krause extended an invitation for her to return to the range whenever she wanted to maintain currency with weapon systems or simply to shoot in an environment where her capabilities would be understood and respected. He noted that he occasionally hosted informal sessions for special operations personnel who needed to maintain skills between deployments, gatherings that were not officially documented, but that provided valuable training opportunities. She expressed appreciation for the offer and indicated that she would likely accept, recognizing the value of maintaining relationships within the professional community. As they concluded their conversation, Chief Krause mentioned one final observation that had been forming throughout their interactions. He said that in his experience, the most accomplished professionals often shared a quality that had nothing to do with technical skill or physical capability. They possessed the confidence to allow others to underestimate them, secure in the knowledge that capability would reveal itself when circumstances required. They did not need validation or recognition because they had proven themselves in contexts where performance mattered more than reputation. Kira smiled at that assessment, the expression reaching her eyes in a way that suggested genuine appreciation for his understanding. She said that operational experience had indeed taught her to value substance over appearance, results over recognition. The previous day's events had forced her into visibility she generally preferred to avoid, but she acknowledged that perhaps some degree of professional presence was necessary for building the civilian career she was attempting to construct. Chief Krause nodded, recognizing the truth in her reflection and the ongoing challenge of balancing capability with discretion. Kira loaded her equipment into her vehicle as the desert sun climbed toward its midday intensity, the heat already shimmering off the pavement in waves that distorted the distant mountains. She had packed methodically, the same economical movements that had characterized everything she did during the two-day session. Chief Krause stood near the range office, ostensibly reviewing paperwork, but actually observing the final departures with the attention to detail that defined his approach to everything. The training session had concluded officially, but its effects would ripple outward in ways that neither Chief Krause nor Kira could fully predict. Word about the shooting demonstration would spread through military and law enforcement communities with the speed that characterized all significant events in tight-knit professional networks. The story would be embellished with each retelling. The distances would grow slightly longer, the conditions would become more challenging, but the essential truth would remain that someone had demonstrated capabilities that few could match. Rourke had departed an hour earlier, but not before spending additional time speaking with Kira about potential collaboration. He had been impressed not just by her shooting, but by her professional demeanor and her ability to communicate complex technical concepts in accessible language. Those qualities mattered in executive protection training, where clients often needed education as much as they needed security. He had made clear that his offer was genuine and that his firm would structure arrangements to accommodate her preferences for privacy and selective engagement. Corporal Hayes had left with renewed enthusiasm for his reserve unit's marksmanship program, carrying notes from his conversations with Kira about training progression and skill development. He had thanked her repeatedly, acknowledging that interactions with someone of her caliber were rare opportunities for soldiers who spent most of their time in conventional training environments. She had promised to follow up with him about potential volunteer instruction, recognizing that working with motivated soldiers might provide satisfaction that consulting work could not fully replace. The transformation in Halloran's attitude had been perhaps the most striking outcome of the session. He had arrived with the swagger of someone accustomed to being the most accomplished shooter in any group, and he had departed with the humility that came from recognizing that skill existed on continuums far beyond what he had previously imagined. Chief Krause suspected that the experience would ultimately benefit Halloran's development, providing the kind of reality check that confident people sometimes needed to unlock their next level of growth. Chief Krause walked across the parking area as Kira closed her vehicle's tailgate. He carried a small package wrapped in plain brown paper, something he had retrieved from his office specifically for this moment. He explained that it contained a range coin, a tradition in precision shooting communities where accomplished marksmen receive tokens commemorating significant achievements. The coin he was presenting featured the range's insignia on one side and a sniper rifle silhouette on the other, with space for engraving that would record the date and the achievement that warranted recognition. Kira accepted the package with visible appreciation, understanding the significance of the gesture within the professional community. Chief Krause explained that he would note in his records that she had achieved confirmed hits at 1,900 meters under challenging conditions, a feat that fewer than 100 people worldwide had accomplished. The coin would serve as tangible recognition of that achievement, something she could carry without compromising operational security or drawing unwanted attention. She thanked him sincerely, noting that she had received similar tokens during her military service, but that those remained in storage along with other aspects of her past that she was still determining how to integrate into her civilian identity. This coin represented something different, she said, a bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming, acknowledgement from someone who understood both contexts and could appreciate the complexity of the transition. Their conversation turned briefly to practical matters, exchanging contact information and discussing potential dates for future training sessions. Chief Krause mentioned that he would be conducting an advanced precision shooting course in 3 months, something that might interest her either as a participant or as a guest instructor. She indicated interest in the latter possibility, acknowledging that teaching forced her to articulate knowledge that had become automatic through repetition, making her more effective both as an instructor and as a shooter. Before she departed, Kira asked Chief Krause a question that had apparently been forming throughout their interactions. She wanted to know whether he thought she had made a mistake by revealing her capabilities so dramatically, whether maintaining her low profile would have served her better in the long term. Her tone suggested genuine uncertainty rather than second-guessing, a professional seeking perspective from someone whose experience provided useful context. Chief Krause considered his response carefully, recognizing that his answer would carry weight beyond the immediate question. He said that capability possessed value only when applied, that hiding ability might provide comfort, but ultimately served no one. The shooting community, like all professional communities, benefited when excellence revealed itself, providing standards for others to pursue and demonstrating what training and dedication could achieve. Her demonstration had challenged assumptions, elevated expectations, and reminded everyone present that mastery existed beyond what most people imagined possible. He acknowledged that visibility carried risks, that attention could create complications she might prefer to avoid. But he also noted that attempting to remain invisible while possessing extraordinary capabilities was its own form of burden, requiring constant vigilance and creating separation from communities where she naturally belonged. The question was not whether to reveal capability, but rather how to manage that revelation in ways that preserved necessary boundaries, while also allowing authentic professional engagement. Kira listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful as she processed his perspective. When he finished, she nodded slowly and said that his assessment aligned with conclusions she had been reaching, but had not fully articulated to herself. The previous 2 days had been uncomfortable at times, forcing her into visibility she usually avoided, but they had also reminded her why she had pursued excellence in precision shooting in the first place. The satisfaction came not from recognition, but from execution, from knowing that she possessed capabilities that mattered, and that she could apply those capabilities when circumstances required. If you enjoyed the story, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite part, character, or if you have had a similar situation happen to you before where someone revealed unexpected expertise. They shook hands one final time, the gesture carrying mutual respect that had developed through shared understanding of professional excellence and the complexities of maintaining identity across different contexts. Chief Krause stepped back as Kira climbed into her vehicle and started the engine. He watched as she drove away from the range, the vehicle disappearing into heat shimmer that made everything at distance appear uncertain and wavering. He remained in the parking area for several minutes after she departed, reflecting on the session and its outcomes. The formal documentation would be straightforward, recording scores and observations in language that satisfied administrative requirements. But the real story of the training session existed in transformed attitudes, in humility learned and respect earned, in the recognition that capability often resided in unexpected places and that assumptions based on appearance or initial impressions rarely survived contact with reality. Chief Krause returned to his office and began preparing his official report, choosing words that would accurately convey what had occurred while respecting the boundaries Kira had requested. The story would spread regardless of how he documented it, but his report would provide the authoritative account that other versions would reference. He smiled slightly as he typed, recognizing that the session at 29 Palms would become part of shooting community lore, the kind of story that instructors would tell to illustrate principles about capability and humility and the dangers of underestimating quiet professionals who let their performance speak louder than their words ever could.